turn my work.
Hi, and welcome to the Raw Heart and Soul podcast. Today I have a special guest with me, Justine Vaisutis. Justine and I have known each other since we were 12 years old, which is a long time.
That is true, a long time.
And the reason I wanted to have Justine on today was because her roles throughout her career have been diverse, but always with, I think, one main anchor and one main element that's continued throughout her career and really relevant today in today's climate. So Justine, tell us a little bit about yourself and your current role as the Head of Education and Engagement and what that entails, but also is that in the private or isn't that in the public sector?
Great question. Thanks, Ten. And thanks for having me today. I'm really excited to be on your podcast. So my current professional role is the Head of Education and Engagement at the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. And our organisation, that organisation is a statutory authority. We work with organisations and communities and individuals in every walk of life. So that's public, private and community, to protect and promote human rights and equal opportunity underneath Victoria's human rights law. So my role as the Head of Education also spans all of that. So my fantastic team of people and colleagues who I work with organisations, workplaces, to ensure that they're aware of their obligations underneath the law, but more importantly, that they're demonstrating behaviours and creating cultures that are really fair and inclusive and where everyone has equal opportunity to achieve and perform and reach their full potential. We also work with communities and individuals and community advocates and community organisations, particularly for groups of people who experience discrimination in Victoria, and we work with them really proactively and constructively to try to address systemic discrimination when they experience it. And we provide really helpful information to members of the public about their rights and their obligations underneath the law. But really our work is focused on protecting and promoting equal opportunity and human rights.
How does someone understand what their human rights are? Like, if you don't know what that is, like, as your role in education, is that your office's job and your team's job to educate the general public about what their rights are? Because I wouldn't even, I basically know, I think, what my human rights are, but yeah, how is that defined?
That is a great question, and it's a really common, that's a really, really common position. So most people, whether they are in a workplace or whether they are what we would call a duty holder, that is someone with obligations underneath our human rights laws, or rights underneath our human rights laws, and of course, most people are both.
Yeah, I was going to say that would encompass everybody, really, because you're a human in society. Yeah.
That's exactly right. So in Victoria, there are 3 human rights laws. One is the Equal Opportunity Act, and most people are familiar with their rights underneath the Equal Opportunity Act. They know that they have a right to be free from discrimination of any sort in employment, that they have a right to enjoy employment or access goods and services without being sexually harassed or victimised for raising a concern. So those rights exist in the Equal Opportunity Act. And the duty holders underneath the Equal Opportunity Act aren't just employers, but they're providers of education, providers of goods and services, clubs. So there's all areas of public life are covered by the Equal Opportunity Act. The second law is the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. And that is a really important law in Victoria because Australia is one of the few developed nations that doesn't have a Commonwealth or a national Bill of Human Rights. It's actually quite rare. So there's no federal overarching human rights legislation. there are different pieces of legislation that protect specific rights, but there's no constitution or bill of human rights. But in Victoria, there is a Charter of Human Rights that's drawn from our international human rights framework, and it protects civil and political rights. So, for example, it gives Victorians additional rights to freedom of expression, freedom of movement, freedom of religion. There's rights around the protection of family and children in there. So there are strengthened human rights in Victoria because of that legislation that people in other states don't enjoy. There are 2 other states in Australia that have human rights, state-specific human rights acts. That is Queensland, and that's only very, very recently. And the other is the ACT. But otherwise, there's no national human rights legislation. And the third is the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act. But as you say, Tan, most people aren't aware that they have rights underneath the Charter in Victoria, and that Charter is really a covenant. It's about the way government, because the duty holders under that Charter are public authorities, so not private business, not clubs, it's not education providers. It's not like, unless they're a public authority, of course, unless it's a government school, for example. But it's different to the Equal Opportunity Act. It's really about the way the government protects the human rights and promotes the human rights of the citizens that it serves.
Why is Victoria special and the ACT and now Queensland? Why do we not have that Commonwealth or that all of Australia? Why is it not inclusive?
Great question. Look, really, it comes down to political will. So the Charter of Human Rights in Victoria was introduced in 2006. And so it's more than 10 years old, and it took a long time for that piece of legislation to be passed. And it's groundbreaking, really, you know, for Victoria and in Australia. And it's contentious because some people find that in an adverse way, human rights actually limit their freedoms. So there have been some state governments that have threatened to abolish the Charter of Human Rights because their position has been that they don't feel it's necessary. They think that it's a bit of a nanny state, that there's too much scrutiny on government, very different reasons. However, there's a really strong body of evidence in international law that human rights legislation is really progressive and does take great steps and improve the rights of people, not just those fundamental civil and political rights that I was talking about, but actually gives them increased protections of rights to really basic public services. So needless to say, I'm a big fan of human rights legislation. But to answer your question, it's because it's not a straightforward matter. It is contentious
and political.
And it's very political. That's right.
Yeah. In terms of where we are in Australia, well, let's just focus on Victoria then. In terms of where we are in progression with Victoria, where do we sit versus the rest of the world? Because I know you've done a lot of travel and seen that and would have access to that now with your role. But are we high up in looking after our human rights here in Australia, or are we moderate in that? And does that come back down to how young we are as a country and a federation?
That is a good question too, and it's very complex because some of the human rights issues in Victoria are really a subset of significant issues that are Australian, that are, you know, very particular to Australia rather than Victoria.
Yep.
But in general, Australia as a whole, and including Victoria and the other progressive states such as Queensland and ACT that have, you know, specific legislation, we do pretty well on the human rights scale. With some notable exceptions. So, you know, most people living in Australia enjoy great freedoms. We enjoy great democratic freedoms.
We can vote.
That's right, and we can vote without fear. You know, we're encouraged to vote. We have really easy access to basic needs. You know, the system is set up to support people to achieve their full potential and access their human rights. That's not to say that that's how it translates. So there are what I would say is cultural issues in Australia that do limit significantly the human rights of some people. I think again, this is contentious, but I think the evidence is very clear that our First Nations people do not and have not experienced great human rights in this country for a very long time, and that is a cultural legacy. And I don't think it's one that we, as a nation, and you know, in developing our identity, have even come near to addressing or understanding. And until we do, I think that will continue. And I think that's a travesty because, you know, our First Nations people are something to be treasured and to be incredibly proud of. You know, Australia is unique in having the oldest living civilization in the world, and to have such rich diversity of countries and nations, you know, in our First Nation. I'm the daughter of a refugee. You know, I have a really lived experience and sense of how grateful people are to enjoy all of those freedoms that we just touched on. You know, democratic freedom, free to walk around on the streets without being fearful for your safety or your life because of your cultural background, or you know, your political beliefs or your religious beliefs. Just really fundamental freedoms that we have, and are really good people and are really committed to contributing to economy, society, you know, the health and safety and the welfare and well-being of their neighbours and their communities. And I think that's really lost in a very binary and unhelpful position, that refugees and asylum seekers are somehow not us. You know, it's just wrong. You know, factually, it's just wrong.
It's factually wrong because we all are. Well,
we're all immigrants, unless we are part of our First Nations. That's right. We're all immigrants to this country. Yeah.
What do you see, and when we're talking about refugees and asylum seekers, and I know we've had this conversation privately because we both read the book, You Can't, what was it called, Sophie McNeill's book, You Can't Say You Didn't Know. And we had this conversation about when your dad came into Australia, and I didn't know that until that point in time. But when people do come in, what is their biggest fear? Like, I know you spoke about your dad not wanting to really share much about his life with you guys because he didn't want you to be seen as anything but Australian. Is that still a common problem with asylum seekers and refugees coming into Australia now? Like, do they feel that pressure to have to change quickly and to have to learn the language? And are we doing that to them?
Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that we're talking about an incredibly diverse cohort of people. You know, we're talking about people who are coming from countries all over the world. So, you know, I think their fears are not singular. Their fears are very, very diverse. But I think, you know, assimilation is a kind of vexed word, but I do think that it's understandable that people want to settle in and fit into a society as quickly and easily as possible so that they can be part of it. And I think that's really structurally difficult for many refugees and asylum seekers coming to Australia. I also think it's very culturally difficult because there are parts of our society, and there are people in Australia who make judgments about other people on the basis of the colour of their skin, for example, and those aren't, you know, necessarily well evidenced judgments. And people tend to adopt stereotypes and they'll apply them to an incredibly diverse range of people as well. So I think those are significant barriers to people feeling like they can settle in and belong and contribute because they're quite pervasive, and that absolutely translates to fear. But I think also people have fear, as any of us would. You know, people want their children to be safe. People want their children to grow up and to be able to enjoy a, you know, really fundamentally safe and free existence. You know, people want to know that they're going to have enough money to put food on the table. Those fundamental drivers that we all have, you know, particularly for the people that we love and care about. You know, those are really, really palpable when for people who are very vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. Who do you see as being the most vulnerable in our society when it comes to human rights? Is there a, like, yeah, who do you see as the most vulnerable?
I think there's a fair bit of evidence that shows that your human rights and your experience in society in Australia is heavily determined by the colour of your skin.
Mm-hmm.
So people, African Australians, you know, anyone who is not a classic white Anglo-Saxon Australian is far more likely to experience discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
There is significant evidence that shows that, and there's quite a bit of research that has been done over the last 7 months that has shown that during the time of COVID, when anxieties and fears are really high, racism also spiked. You know, so it shows that that's how people take their fear and frustration out. You know, they find targets.
Yeah.
So, and with that comes complexity. So, you know, we talk about intersectionality, which is a really kind of crude way of explaining that, you know, people aren't a gender or a cultural background or a religious background. We're everything, you know. So people aren't just female. They might be female from a particular cultural background, you know, from a particular socioeconomic cohort and a religious cohort. And, you know, depending on where you sit and how many layers there are to all of us, that really impacts the way you experience human rights and equal opportunity in Australia. I think too that despite the fact that we're a really well-resourced country, and this has been evidenced in royal commissions, you know, it's not something that just comes from a human rights sector, but people with a disability do not enjoy the same access to life, I would say, or access to public life, as you know, in terms of a human right, as many of us do. I think, you know, as a country, Australia still has a long way to go in improving access to human rights for people with a disability.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
I was going to go somewhere with that question. When did you become passionate about human rights in your life? Because you work for Amnesty International, and was that one of your life goals, to work for Amnesty?
It was at the time, actually, and it was quite, I mean, I loved working for Amnesty and I'm still a supporter. And in terms of my career, I didn't work for them for a really long period of time. But I remember when I got the job, I was just over the moon. I was so excited. And then, of course, it turned out that Amnesty is full of really passionate, normal people, you know,
Yep.
and made some very good friends while I was there, you know, some of whom I still know. But I have to say, I think I don't really remember when I was interested or passionate about human rights, because I know it was as early as school. You know, I know I was interested in Amnesty International as an organisation, for example, in high school.
I remember that.
And I think really what underpins that is that I've always been very passionate about everyone having a fair go, like, which is a very Australian value. You know, that I think that is something that unifies us, is that regardless of what your political beliefs or, you know, your walk of life, where you're from in Australia and this, you know, big, beautiful, diverse land, that fundamental notion that everyone should have a fair go is very Australian. And that is actually what equal opportunity and human rights is all about. You know, that framework, that rights-based framework, is absolutely about ensuring everyone really does have a fair go and a fair crack at being the best that they can be and having the best life that they can. And I've always felt very passionate about that, and that is probably that has probably come from both of my parents and their influence. You know, my father and his experience having come to Australia, and his family's experience as a refugee family, but also my mother's experience being really passionate about, you know, she was a public school teacher. She was really committed to, you know, educating kids from all walks of life, because she knows that education is such a critical basis to enabling people, you know, and those just fundamental tenets, I think, were big influences on me.
What did you study at university when we first came out of high school?
I did an arts degree, and it was a specific program. It was called International Development Studies. So it was a program designed for people who wanted to enter the aid sector, and the development was, at the time, was third world development. The terminology's changed quite a bit since then. And I have to say, when I started that degree, I was really bright-eyed and I'd say quite naive, because it was a real education that really made me aware that how fraught development is. You know, I really learned a lot, not just about the development sector, and that's not to say that, you know, incredibly valuable and critical work is done by lots of organisations and countries in the development field. So I'm certainly not saying that, but just how fraught it is and how culturally complex it is, you know, that, and it was an education for me too, you know, a real self-reflection that what were you thinking, that you could just, you know, go on in and you know, that's right. And that, you know, that somehow a civilized or a developed country somehow has the answers, you know, really dispelled that myth for me. And really, I think that was my greatest education coming out of that degree, that that notion that anyone has all the answers has actually created more problems and more damage in many instances, not always, but, you know, development, third world development is a wicked problem, you know, and you know, by wicked problem, you know, obviously make it so utterly complex, and trying to address it in a linear fashion always results in a worse outcome. So, you know, and so that really had an impact on me, and it made me reconsider, if I had the resilience and the strength to do that, to pursue that kind of a career, but also if it was something that I actually wanted to do. Like, I wasn't really sure if my values aligned with that anymore, not because I didn't want to make a contribution, but it made me think maybe there are other ways that I can make a contribution actually.
When you came out of uni and when you made that realization, is that when you got the job with Lonely Planet and decided to travel, or did you decide to travel and then get the job with Lonely Planet?
I did a bit of travel. I traveled before that, and I was very interested in writing. So I had always loved writing throughout high school as well, and university. I was really keen to find a job where I could marry those two loves, you know, travel and writing. So it was really the travel that came first, and a lot of work to actually get paid work as a writer. Like, it took me quite a, you know, I mean, that's a hard kind of path. It's not easy, and it, you know, it's not like I have innate talent that hundreds and thousands of other people don't have, or much greater talent than me as a writer.
Yeah.
So I worked really hard to get contracted by Lonely Planet, and really worked hard to maintain my reputation as a reliable author. Like many authors do. It was really incredibly hard work, really long days, whether when you're on the road or writing up, it's very isolating work, but a huge privilege. I saw some magnificent things because of that work that I was really grateful for. And it also enabled me, in the downtime. So when I didn't have an LP, a Lonely Planet job on, it enabled me to pursue other writing that I was really interested in. So, I continued writing for Amnesty International quite a bit during that time, and, other human rights related and travel related writings. It was really perfect. It was a great chunk of my life for a period of time. And I decided to make a change. Really, I guess it was my early to mid 30s when I decided, I don't know if I want to do this for the rest of my life. So if I'm going to do something different, now's the time to make that. Yeah, exactly.
What do you feel, or what do you believe when I say the term soul purpose?
For me, the way I translate that and interpret it is what matters most to you in life. So really digging deep and, reflecting really carefully on my values and what it is that drives me and motivates me and energizes me and fulfills me. And for me, that's a constant process, because like anyone, I'm really subject to influence and pressure from others, from society, from expectations on me, on all of us, about what matters, whether that's money or status or kudos or all of those things. And just being focused about, what it is about that is important to you. And always, well, for me, it's always clear that, of course, what matters most is the people I love and care about most, and whether or not I can really truly look myself in the mirror and say, with integrity, and say, you're doing what you think you should be doing. You're making the contribution that you think you should be making to the world and to the people around you. And you're doing something that you should and feel good and proud about. Because if you're not doing that, I think for me, that's how I translate that. I'm not meeting my soul purpose.
Yeah. How has, and I'm going to tie this together again now, or tie it together now. How can you see a thread throughout your life that has been a common factor in everything that you've done? And is that like wanting everybody to have the basic human needs or have the human rights that they should have? Is that part of your sole purpose? Like, do you think that your job is to, or your role is to help people understand that for themselves?
Yes, I'd go further and say I really do want to preface this by saying I'm just talking about me, because I don't want this to come across like I've got any expectations on other people or of other people.
Yeah.
But I actually feel that I have an obligation to do that with my life, because I know how privileged I am, and that that knowledge is shaped by the travel that I've done in countries where I know that for most Australians, unless you've been to incredibly really poor countries, you just can't fathom what daily life is remotely like. You can't access that experience, that palpable experience, through TV or video or the internet, but just understanding what that is like day after day, and how removed my privilege is from that, So I've always had that really profound sense of how privileged my life is because I'm a white middle class Australian. You know, that's really hitting the jackpot globally.
Right.
And for me, I feel that gives me an obligation to make a difference to other people. But so that as a really, that underpins what I do and why I do it. But I think the common thread is curiosity, you know, and I think that curiosity is really important because, you know, it goes back to that, I guess, the point I was trying to make about what I learnt in my very first degree, and that was, you don't know anything. You have got to do a whole lot of learning first about culture, people, religion, you know, experiences, until you know what role you can play to add value or contribute. And that's a lifelong journey.
Right.
And I really love that about my current job, that so much of it is about engaging with incredibly different people and listening, you know, a lot of listening and understanding, and thinking about what role I can play to advocate or support or promote or, you know, engage with. And that's constant, you know, that curiosity and that education.
Great answer, Just. I spoke with a former client of mine a couple of days, well, last week actually. She's on the podcast this week, Monica Meldrum, and she spoke about going into Cambodia. So she runs a company called Whole Kids Australia, and part of her mission and part of her establishing that company was so that she could be able to afford to support other communities that weren't as fortunate as what we are. So she's done that through, I think it's Plan International. She supports them in Cambodia. But I think one of her realizations, and I had this when I was listening to her, was that she went there thinking that she could help them, when she realized the amount that she got back in return for just like her learning experience and her children's learning experience, because she took her 6-year-old daughter there with her and a group of friends. Their learning experience was far greater a gift to them than they could ever give to these people. Is that something that you've experienced as well?
Yeah, that really resonates with me. In fact, I actually think that altruism, the concept of altruism, is a bit of an artificial construct, you know, because the notion of altruism is that you do something for no personal gain whatsoever for yourself. You do something that benefits somebody else and you receive no personal gain at all. And I just don't think that that is the case, you know, because I think there's so much personal reward, you know, that's what drives, I think, you know, if you're interested in helping other people, that interest and being able to fuel that interest and feed it and achieve it, that's what you get out of the process. So I don't actually think, you know, altruism really truly exists, and I really do understand that that reward, you know, and a lot of that reward is around education, and I mean that broadly, of course, you know.
Of course.
Yeah, and you know, the more you embrace diversity and understand, you know, different cultures and people and religions and their motivations and, you know, their families, you know, the better you are as a person, I think, you know, the more enriched you are as a human being. And there's nothing altruistic about that. That's all personal reward. Yeah.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about RoundTrip and how that came to be.
So RoundTrip Foundation, we are now going into this is our 7th year in operation.
Wow.
We're a registered charity in Australia, and we work with dedicated partners overseas to support sustainable grassroots programs. RoundTrip started really via a very good friend of mine, Alan, who was also a Lonely Planet author.
Yeah.
And he decided he had been supporting communities that he had encountered in his travel and work just on a personal basis for a really long time, financially supporting them. And he decided that he wanted to try to formalise that more, and he really wanted to have a go at setting up an organisation. And he asked me if I wanted to be involved, and I did. You know, I was really attracted to that idea and that prospect. So we started that organisation. There were 5 of us, and we literally sat around my kitchen table and had a meeting. And our first conversation was like, we knew what we wanted to do, and we even had programs and communities identified, you know, and very strong links to those existing, really strong existing links to those communities. But we just started with, okay, how do we do this? And it was a massive learning curve on, you know, about how to set up an organisation, how to try to attract donations, how to, you know, establish all of the infrastructure and the governance and the diligence that we needed, which was my gig. You know, I've been the secretary of the organisation since then. So all of the governance is really my responsibility. Which is quite dry in many ways, but for me, it's the best way I can support my colleagues on the board. So there are 5 of us who are on the board of RoundTrip Foundation, and we effectively run the company, or the organisation, I should say. We meet once every 6 weeks or so. We make decisions. We have a fantastic communications director, a fantastic director of international programs. Alan's our president. It's a really great and diverse experience on that management committee. And we all complement each other. So I know that if I'm doing my gig properly, which is making sure that we're registered, we've got our deductible gift status, we're a registered fundraiser, all of that, you know, that really thorough due diligence and governance, they can just go and do that magic. And as a result of that, and I really pay credit to Alan and currently Kate, who's our Director of International Programs, you know, we've done some really amazing work, particularly in Africa and Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, we've supported, I think it's probably about, I'm going to get the number wrong here, but it's at least 60 young women, probably far greater than that actually, because it's over a series of years, who are incredibly vulnerable and at risk of homelessness in Sri Lanka, because they've been sexually abused by a member of the community or a family member and cast out by their family. So we've got a very close partner in Sri Lanka who Alan has known for a very long time. He runs a volunteer organisation, and we worked with him to set up the bakery school, which provides these young women with a multi-week program, a training program to train them as pastry chefs, so that they are basically trained with a trade, which gives them not just economic independence and security. That's right, stability. It actually gives them a future, because the alternative is really terrible. You know, the alternative is homelessness or sex work or vulnerability to trafficking, human trafficking. And, you know, the program's been incredibly successful. Overwhelmingly, we've done about 8 to 10 rounds of those workshops over the years. We've also delivered it or funded the delivery of it to a cohort of special needs young women. So, you know, we know that work makes a profound difference. And our gig is to raise the money to keep that school going, you know, and to promote the work of the school. And, you know, we've had students who've been through that training program several years ago come back and talk to other students about, you know, what it's done and how it's changed their life around.
And what they're doing after it, and how that can, I guess it doesn't impact them just in terms of financial and being able to get a job. I imagine it would empower them with a bit of confidence and someone to believe in them, that there is more than what maybe their limited options were, that it opens their horizons to what might not be possible if they didn't see that, or if they didn't go through that experience, so that they have got a wider view of choices that they might have.
That's right. That's exactly right. And for some, it has resulted in or initiated or precipitated conciliation and reunion with their families. So,
That's
you know,
awesome.
it's really, yeah. And it's actually, you know, in terms of finances, you know, it's an incredibly lean program, which is one of the reasons why we're so committed to it, you know, and so committed to ensuring that we just continue to raise funds to support it, because the outcomes are so profound, you know.
It's such a small amount of money, and that the big thing that you can do for somebody.
That's right. And going back to your point, you know, I freely admit that there's nothing that altruistic about that. Like, I just get such, you know, such incredible reward thinking that, you know, because I ensure that our annual financial reporting is all in order, you know,
that opportunity is available.
That's right. You know, it's just part of that bigger picture that it's really contributed to that work. And again, you know, the biggest hero in that story is really our partner in Sri Lanka. His name's Janaka, and you know, just how committed he is to his own community. And his story is, you know, part of that, the reason he's so committed to that is because he lost his family in the tsunami. So, you know, he's really shaped by that and the importance of providing value and adding value in the community.
What would you like people to remember about this conversation, or what would you like people to think about in terms of how they can be better people in our community?
I think it would make me really happy to know that people think twice before making a judgment or maintaining a stereotype of other people, and you know, maybe even go out of their way to engage with someone that they never thought they would, or you know, to engage with someone that they have really strongly held negative beliefs about, and just to learn how similar we all really are as human beings, and how much better we are as a society when we work together and support each other and understand one another than if we're, you know, siloed.
Thanks for being here today, Justine. It's been wonderful to speak with you.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Tan. It's been an absolute